I got pregnant with the boss's kid and will soon become his wife. At that moment, something inside me snapped. Michelle, my husband's mistress, had been mocking me, showing off her youth and trying to prove she was better than me. She even took my job as the president's secretary, and now she wants my husband too. I decided I wouldn't hold back anymore. I was determined to make them both suffer. I signed the divorce papers that Scott gave me, but I got a lot of money in return. Scott and Michelle got married in France with a grand ceremony. A week later, I got a call from Michelle. "Hey, Scott hasn't come home. As his ex-wife, you must know where he is, right?" Michelle's voice was frantic. I laughed maliciously. Just as I had expected, I kept quiet, but I exposed Scott's terrible secrets. "My name is Kelly. I'm 61 years old and work as the president's secretary at my husband Scott's company. Every day, I wake up at 7 a.m., earlier than my husband, to prepare breakfast. Then I go to work alone, tidying up and cleaning the president's office to make sure Scott works comfortably. At 9 a.m., Scott arrives at the office. "Thank you, Kelly, you cleaned again today," he says. I approach him and retie his tie. "It's fine, dear. You want to work in a clean room, right?" I reply, "That's right," he answers. Scott and I were introduced by an acquaintance. We haven't had children, but we've lived together, supporting each other for 31 years. The company, taken over by Scott from his father-in-law, is stable, and I've had no complaints about our life. By the way, the new business you planned, Johnny is going to fund it. The transfer was confirmed earlier, Scott tells me. "That's great. John seems to like you." "Your negotiating helped a lot," I respond. The company is run by Scott as the president and his brother, Johnny, as the chairman. Scott calls him John. "Remember, Johnny funded another business you planned before. Aren't you proceeding with that?" I ask. I casually asked Scott, and he looked annoyed. "It's fine, I'll handle it." "Nothing special on today's schedule, right?" he said. "Yes, because you mentioned it before," I replied. Scott smiled contentedly. "Good, good. Then, Kelly, there's someone I want to introduce to you. I'll bring them here, so wait for me." "Understood," I said, feeling uneasy about his words. Soon, I heard laughter from the hallway, Scott's voice and another, younger woman's voice. As I wondered about their friendly demeanor, the office door opened. "Kept you waiting, huh, Kelly?" Scott said, looking pleased. But I was too focused on the woman sitting next to him to respond. She was very young, with long, neatly arranged hair. She wore a miniskirt that revealed her thighs and a camisole that exposed her chest. It was like she was dressed for a night out, but she wore it confidently. I was astounded by her youth. "This is Michelle. She'll be working here from today," Scott said. "Nice to meet you," Michelle added. I was dumbfounded. Was this a joke? My husband introducing a young woman to me was hard enough to handle. Moreover, we don't hire fresh graduates. "Excuse me, but how old is Michelle?" I asked. "She's 24. I met her at a bar with friends. We hit it off. She's young and fresh and gives me energy. Don't you think she'll boost the morale of our employees?" "Ah, yes," I managed to say, seeing my husband's radiant expression. "Then, Kelly, please teach Michelle the ropes." "Michelle is going to work as a general employee, right? Then wouldn't it be better if—" I started. "Oh, I forgot to mention, we're going to have 2 secretaries from now on. So please teach Michelle the secretary work." "2 secretaries? Is that necessary?" I asked, feeling a pang in my heart. "Well, you're getting on in years. It's okay to pass on work to the younger ones." Scott laughed lightly, and it hurt. "The way you say it," I thought to myself. "Then take care. I'm going out for a bit on a personal errand. I'm counting on you to show her the ropes." With that, Scott left Michelle and me alone in the office. I took a deep breath to calm myself. Once Scott decides on something, he tends to rush into it and often regrets it later. This has happened many times throughout our marriage. It's useless to argue at times like this. For now, I'll just do as he says. It's bound not to work out anyway. Hey, Kelly, Michelle tapped my shoulder. Yes, I replied. How old are you, Kelly? She asked. It felt wrong not to answer after asking her age. I told her the truth. I'll be 61 this year, but my sincere feelings didn't reach Michelle. What? You're as old as my grandmother. Poor thing, you could die any time and yet you still work. That's kind of sad, she said. I gave a wry smile. I like my job. It's not sad. Oh, I see. The sad one is the boss, right? Whether he's at home or at work, he's always with an old woman. Really poor thing. With each word, my face grew more strained. What exactly are you trying to say? You don't get it. I guess when you get older, your brain starts to slow down. Michelle let out a big sigh and said clearly, being young and beautiful, I have higher status than an old lady like you. You understand, right? Her smile was full of confidence, and I shivered. I couldn't stay silent any longer. You know, you should learn some common sense. Did I make you angry? Is it menopause? She asked. You get angry so quickly. It must be hard to keep working if you get upset over such things. Plus, with menopause, you sweat a lot and get short of breath, right? It's embarrassing to try so hard. Maybe it's time for you to retire. As I stood there, dumbfounded, Michelle laughed and whispered in my ear, Why don't you retire as president's wife too? I shuddered. This person intended to take Scott away from me. I couldn't help but raise my voice. Enough is enough. With that kind of intention, I can't teach you anything. Leave the company right now. I expected a quarrel, but Michelle looked at me with tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry. I just wanted to get along with you, Kelly, and made a joke, but it was too much. Too much. Michelle collapsed to the floor, sobbing like the heroine of a tragedy. I'll leave this company. Thank you for everything. Michelle ran out of the room. What is happening? Overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events, I stood there dumbfounded until Michelle returned with a red-faced Scott in tow. What are you doing? His sudden yell made me tremble. What's wrong, dear? I heard from Michelle you yelled at her. It's because she said something terrible. Don't lie. I've been listening to your conversation. Michelle had recorded our argument on her mobile phone. The recording started from the moment I scolded Michelle, giving the impression that I suddenly blamed her without reason and made her cry. That's why she apologized so sincerely, sobbing and all. I bit my lip in frustration. You don't believe me. Believe Michelle. She came to me crying about what you did. There's a recording. It's clear whose words have more credibility. A secretary who bullies employees is fired as of today. I couldn't believe it. I had always supported Scott both at home and at work. Now he was abandoning me for Michelle, who just joined the company. Wait, then who will do the secretary's job? I asked. It's decided. Michelle will do it, Scott said. That's impossible. And what about you? I swallowed the words that almost slipped out and tried again in a way only Scott and I would understand. You know about your hobby. I'll handle that myself. I prefer pure and cute Michelle over you, who lies to me. Besides, a young and beautiful girl like her suits me better than you do, don't you think? Scott narrowed his eyes happily and looked at Michelle beside him. She looked up at Scott with adoration and flashed a brilliant smile. Then she turned to me and stuck out her tongue just a little. I protested to Scott many times, but he wouldn't listen. The job of a secretary is not easy, despite my insistence that Michelle couldn't handle it. All I got back were his overly optimistic words, saying it was an exaggeration or you won't know until you try. He must have thought he was a knight protecting his princess. I was speechless at his foolishness, hardly what you'd expect from someone running a company. Eventually, Scott threw out my personal items from my workspace. Instead, he arranged a brand new desk and cute stationery for young people, all for Michelle. It was all in vain. Realizing this, I decided not to waste any more effort and left the company. However, Scott didn't come home that night. He didn't return my calls either. I thought it was just his way of getting back at me, but as a week, a month, and then 5 months passed, I grew anxious. One day, I was called to the company by Scott and was heading to the president's office. Maybe he finally understood how hard the secretary's job was and decided to let Michelle go and call me back. I knocked on the president's office door with a sliver of hope. "Come in," Scott said. As I opened the door, I was met with an unbelievable scene. Scott, smiling happily, was holding hands with Michelle beside him. The two of them looked at me and laughed joyously. "It's been a while, Kelly. We have some big news today," Scott said. "What is it?" I asked. Actually, then Michelle put her hand over Scott's mouth. "Let me say it, okay? I want to thank the wife, right?" Scott nodded deeply, and Michelle said to me with a beaming smile, "We're getting married. Thank you for everything you've done for Scott." "What?" In front of my shaking self, Scott laughed sheepishly. "No," I thought. "There's no point in hiding it. I'm thinking of starting a second life. You're getting too old. It's better for you to live quietly by yourself." "What? How dare you?" I felt as if all the blood had drained from my body. "Wait a minute, Kelly, the talk isn't over yet. Here, a present," Michelle said, handing me a few sheets of paper. They were printed with black and white photos. Seeing them made me feel sick. "This ultrasound. Don't tell me," I started. Michelle nodded slowly and gently stroked her belly as she came closer and whispered in my ear, "I got pregnant with Scott's child. I'll be taking over as the president's wife," she laughed. At that moment, something inside me snapped. She had mocked me, flaunted her youth, and tried to assert her superiority at every turn. She even took my job as the president's secretary, and now she's aiming for Scott. Well, I won't hold back anymore. I'll make sure they both suffer. I signed the divorce papers that Scott handed me. Of course, I received a hefty compensation. They had a grand wedding in France. Things changed a week later when I got a call from Michelle. "Hey, Scott hasn't come home. As his ex-wife, you must know where he is, right?" Michelle's voice was frantic. I laughed maliciously. Just as I had expected, I kept quiet for a moment, then said, "Scott is probably in San Jose right now." "San Jose? Ever heard of it? There's this big hotel in San Jose with a casino. Scott always rushes there whenever he has a chance," I explained. Michelle gasped. "Does that mean?" "Yes, Scott is probably indulging in gambling right now." I was the one who carefully scheduled his time to prevent him from getting too involved. It seems the new secretary was kept in the dark. He didn't want to show his bad side, spending the money he earned on gambling. Michelle was silent, seemingly in shock. I let out a small laugh. "I'm actually thankful to you." "What?" Michelle asked. "Scott started getting into gambling these past few years. It seems someone from a new business partner invited him," I said. "And what about it?" she asked. "Before you came along, there was still a bit of affection left in Scott. I was worried about him falling deeper, but now I've completely cut him off. Taking such a low man off my hands, and even giving me a hefty compensation, there couldn't have been a better opportunity. Thanks to you, I can enjoy my second life." I laughed heartily. I could hear Michelle breathing heavily over the phone. "Don't you dare joke about this," she shouted. "Goodbye. You have a tough road ahead as the president's wife," I said. I said sarcastically and hung up on Michelle, ignoring her shouting from the other end. A few days later, as I was relaxing in my new condo, the doorbell rang. Could it be a delivery? I haven't ordered anything, I thought, feeling suspicious. I looked through the peephole and saw my ex-husband, Scott, his face red with anger. "You're there, aren't you, Kelly? How dare you tell Michelle about the gambling?" Understanding the situation, I decided to let Scott in. He must have hired a detective to find my address. Running away now would only lead to him chasing me again. I might as well settle things here. I had important information to share with him. I prepared a clear file of documents before opening the door. It's been a while, hasn't it? I greeted him with a graceful smile. What do you mean, it's been a while? After you ruined my family, how can you still smile? Scott was furious, shouting and trying to intimidate me, but such tactics didn't work on a wife of many years. Why are you so red-faced? What happened? It's none of your business, he snapped. I chuckled. He came here just to vent his anger, but I could see through what had happened between them. You must have had a fight with your wife. Shut up. Michelle must be unhappy with most of your income going to gambling. She told you she would manage the finances, and you're on an allowance now, right? Scott froze in shock. How? How do you know that? Did you plant a bug or something? He asked seriously, and I burst into laughter. You did the same thing with me when your gambling came to light. You said, "What's wrong with spending the money I earned on my hobby?" You must have repeated the same with Michelle, leading to a fight, and now you're taking it out on me. Scott clenched his fists and fell silent. Don't underestimate a wife of 31 years, I thought to myself, seeing his frustrated face. You should be thankful I managed your schedule as your secretary. I minimized your gambling time to save you from ruin. Can a naive 25-year-old do that? Well, he started. You have no choice but to let her try. You're having a child after all. At that word, Scott's face lit up. Yes, Michelle and I are having a child. Unlike you, who's infertile, she can give me an heir. You lost as a woman. Scott looked down on me triumphantly. That's great for you. We're happy, I said. Don't try to ruin my family again. I came here to warn you today. Scott pointed at me, saying so. I tilted my head, puzzled. Me ruin it? I have no such intention. In fact, I'm thinking of helping you. Help me? Scott looked confused. Did you go with Michelle to the gynecologist? Huh? That place is for women. Michelle said she wanted to go alone, so I didn't go with her. You saw the ultrasound photo, right? The glossy, thick photo paper. No, the one I saw was just thin, regular paper. I thought so, I said, presenting Scott with several photos from a clear file. They were grainy black and white ultrasound images. Scott's eyes widened. What? You're pregnant? Of course not. This was a gift from Michelle. She's quite prepared, isn't she? Printing these out from the internet for me. Internet? Scott looked puzzled. I handed him a piece of paper. It was a printout of a blog post from 3 years ago, a pregnancy announcement with ultrasound photos. Compare this with the photo Michelle showed you. Notice anything? Scott looked back and forth between the photo and the article. His face turned pale. You don't mean? That's right. The copied photo from the article matches Michelle's ultrasound photo. Holding them up to the light, the baby silhouette matches perfectly. Do you know about image search? It's a feature that searches the internet for images similar to the one you have. I found this blog using it. She must have copied the article directly, cutting out the photo neatly. So the child, Scott went pale, looking like he might collapse. I decided it was time to deliver the final blow. It's a lie. There's no baby. Scott collapsed to his knees. No, that can't be. She wouldn't lie about something like that. Impossible. After everything I bought for her designer clothes, bags, even an expensive engagement ring. Scott vented his confused emotions by repeatedly hitting the floor with his fist. His actions were so ridiculous I couldn't help but smile. It's a shame you couldn't become a father. Considering your age, it's doubtful you could have fathered a child. Thinking a young partner would guarantee a child was naive. Ask Michelle for the truth. I'll call her over now. Scott was too drained to argue. He just slumped there, silent. I had Michelle come to the condominium. Soon after, the doorbell rang, and I opened the door. Upon seeing me with Scott, she screamed. What are you doing here? Trying to take Scott back from me? No. Didn't I say I was thankful to you? I have a baby in my belly. You can't tear us apart. Michelle screamed triumphantly. Not listening to me, she entered and gently embraced Scott's shoulder. "Are you okay? Let's go back and talk about the money," she said. "I'll manage the finances. That's okay, right? We'll overcome this together. After all, I'm carrying our child," Michelle said. "Shut up." Scott slowly stood up, looking at Michelle intently. "The pregnancy is a lie, isn't it?" Michelle's face contorted. "What are you talking about, honey? Tell me the truth, Michelle." "The pregnancy is real. I showed you the ultrasound photo. Our child is the fruit of our love. How can you deny that?" Michelle sat on the floor, crying, then glared sharply at me. "You must have filled his head with weird ideas. You're just jealous because you're old and I'm young and beautiful." I laughed. "Is that all you have to say?" "Hey, Scott, let's just go home, okay?" Michelle tried to pull Scott's arm, but he brushed her off. "Enough, Michelle." Scott thrust the blog post copy and the ultrasound photo at her. "There's no escaping the truth now. I trusted you. How could you lie about something like this? I was so happy," I cried. Michelle's expression changed. "Hey, Scott." She looked at me with wet eyes, seeking sympathy. "I just wanted to test your love for me. I was afraid I was just being played with. That's why I said I was pregnant." "Then, Scott, you said you wanted me to have it, right? I was so happy." Michelle's radiant smile left Scott speechless. "So the lie was because you love me." "That's right. We can start working on having a child now. My beauty and your brains will make a wonderful child who'll eventually become a president and earn lots of money." "That's not going to happen," I said, bringing Scott and Michelle back to reality. "Hey, we're having a moment here," Michelle snapped. "Do you really think this man has money?" "Of course, he's a president after all." "I see. Our company has been passed down through generations and isn't doing badly, but that's about the company as a whole. This man is a gambler. Do you understand what that means?" Michelle's face turned pale as she clung to Scott. "Hey, Scott, you're rich, right? You told me once we're married we live a wealthy life because you have more money than you know what to do with." Scott responded in a faltering voice. "It's okay. I've lost some money gambling, but we're starting a new business soon. That'll be our big break." "What are you talking about?" I pointed out Scott's ugly lies. "I know for a fact there's no new business venture planned." "What do you mean? You got funding from Johnny recently, right? Where's that money now? Surely it wasn't spent on luxury brands and an engagement ring for a new wife." I glared at Scott. "What? That's not something I would do." Scott laughed derisively, though his voice trembled. I sighed briefly. "You embezzled the company's money," I said. Scott swallowed hard under my steady gaze. "I had suspicions. You've been saying you're starting new ventures and getting funding from Johnny, but no business ever materializes. Just one new venture after another. It was odd not to doubt, so I spoke with Johnny to gather solid evidence. You teamed up against me. The money John transferred that day was a decoy. You transferred the business funds directly into your own bank account this time. Usually you're more careful, using various accounts to avoid detection. Were you that desperate for money, trying to prove to Michelle you're wealthy?" Scott fumbled for words, confirming my suspicions. I said the last word, "You're done. Get arrested and live as a criminal for the rest of your life." "Shut up. It's a family matter. It'll probably just end with probation. Besides, John will bail me out. Even if I'm charged, I'll be out in no time," Scott reassured himself. "How do you know all this? You were supposed to be fired. You have nothing to do with this." "Johnny told me." "John did?" "Yeah, it's me. Johnny hired me." Scott opened his mouth in surprise. I explained calmly, "Yes. When he heard you dumped me, he contacted me immediately. He apologized for your terrible actions and asked if he could hire me back. I said yes right away." "You didn't know. John is keeping it from me. That bastard." "I'm grateful to Johnny. He put me in charge of schedule management, and I'm earning more than before." I showed a broad smile, and Scott gritted his teeth. That John. I'll confront him right now, Scott said as he was about to leave. That's when it happened. Michelle grabbed Scott's arm and pulled him towards her with strength, their faces almost touching. Her expression was devilish. Hey, you lied to me, flaunting your wealth. In reality, you're just an old criminal. Don't mess with me. I'm sorry, Michelle, Scott said, terrified, taking Michelle's hand and looking into her eyes. He slowly said, but it's okay. I'll probably get probation and I can return home. I might be out of the company, but we can still be happy without money if we're together. Don't joke with me. Michelle shook off Scott's hand and glared at him as if he were trash. There's no way a beautiful young woman like me would live with an old, penniless man like you. I lied about being pregnant to get us to marry. What a waste of time. The worst. Michelle shoved Scott aside and left the room. Michelle, wait for me, Scott called out, but Michelle shut the door behind her. He stood at the entrance like a ghost. I spoke to Scott. Please leave. This is my house. Kelly, can't we start over? Me as the president and you as the secretary like before? Scott tried to charm me with a smile, but I flatly rejected him. It's impossible. I hate you. I never want to see your face again. Scott's eyes widened, and he started to tremble. Enough of that, I said, opening the door and pushing him out. I locked the door and began watching TV. Scott quietly left, realizing it was all over. Later, Scott was arrested. He thought Johnny would bail him out, but that was wrong. He was taken to a cold jail cell alone. Scott was arrested for embezzling funds entrusted to him by Johnny. Besides, he had told suppliers and related companies he was starting new ventures, asking for loans, and then diverting those funds to his personal account for private use. Scott received a sentence without probation and won't be out for several years. As for Michelle, she was suspected of conspiring with Scott and was investigated. Though no evidence of conspiracy was found, the police discovered she had been skimming money from various businessmen, approaching wealthy-looking men in bars, becoming their girlfriend, and then claiming she needed money for a pregnancy or a parent's surgery. Essentially, Scott was also a victim of Michelle's scams. Michelle was arrested for fraud. Both of them ended up in the care of the police. Half a year has passed since Scott's arrest. I am still working with Johnny, trying to recover the company's image. It's not easy, and Johnny is always worried. I want to support him, feeling grateful to him. One evening, I returned to the company with Johnny. He sank deeply into his chair and exhaled. It's been a tiring day. We had a series of business dinners. Johnny looked into my eyes and smiled. Ah, but thanks to you, Kelly, for picking a good restaurant. We had an enjoyable meal. Many of the clients are around my age, so they appreciated the healthy yet luxurious dining experience. Plus, none of them knew about today's place. It was like a surprise. Thanks to that, the conversation flowed well. Thank you. Johnny wore a gentle smile. Unlike Scott, Johnny is always calm and composed. When he speaks with someone, he always uses polite language, and his sincere character is evident. I find Johnny's personal charm appealing. It's too kind of you to say, I replied. I thanked him. Johnny sighed contentedly. To think someone as capable as you was Scott's spouse is truly surprising. I chuckled lightly. Former spouse, I have no relation with him anymore. Right, he said. By the way, Kelly, how long do you plan to work? Don't you think about retiring and living quietly at home? I answered with a smile. I love my work. As long as I'm physically able, I want to keep working. Johnny nodded happily. I want you to help me rebuild this company. It's going to be a long partnership, but I'm counting on you from now on. I nodded firmly. Yes, Johnny. Johnny laughed, amused. Seeing his laughter made me feel warm inside. My second life is surely going to be enjoyable. Looking at Johnny's smile, I thought just that.